Nauru is the smallest republic in the world at just 21 square kilometers and has a GDP of 118 million. However, at one time it was the second richest country in the world per capita, and its influence was felt far beyond its miniature stature. But this is not a story of how an impoverished and politically obscure nation grew rich and harnessed its chance. It's a story of downfall and how greed and mismanagement crippled this country, forcing it to rely on revenues from Australian detention centres, and sold its legitimacy to breakaway states, whilst the island's interior was left ravaged by the very business that once made this country rich. Like so many stories of downfall of a once prosperous nation, we need to rewind to when the island was first discovered by Europeans. In 1798, a captain, John Fern, became the first European to sight the island, naming it Pleasant Island, but it wouldn't be until the 1830s when Europeans would start to have extensive contact with the native people, who had inhabited the island for at least 3,000 years. Encounters with the Europeans did bring trade between the islanders, such as food, alcohol and palm wine. However, a far more dangerous good was being exchanged: firearms. By the arrival of the Europeans, the period of isolation between Nauruans and outsiders had led to a distinctive language and society being formed, made up of 12 kinships, each having a chief. But when rifles were supplied to the population, this at times rocky yet balanced system boiled out into war when a disagreement over etiquette at dinner would lead to a son of a clan chief being fatally shot. The war would go on for 10 years, facing provocation from Europeans, such as convicts sent to the island or dismissed whalers. The bloodshed would finally finish in 1888, when the German Empire intervened and confiscated 791 rifles from the island. However, in just that 10 years, over a third of the population died, and on top of this, new diseases from Europe were ripping through the nation. The fortunes of this nation, however, would begin to turn due to one fateful discovery in 1900, when a prospector discovered phosphate on the island, an incredibly valuable resource that luckily was in great abundance. Nauru's future would be called, however, into question when Australia would annex the island in 1914, taking it from the German Empire, as part of the British attempt to lessen German influence in the region. In 1919, after the conclusion of the First World War, it was agreed that the governments of Australia, New Zealand and the UK would oversee phosphate mining on the islands, but tragedy would strike again in Nauru in 1923, when an influenza pandemic would sweep the nation, with mortality rates as high as 18% among the native Nauruans. Then just 2 decades later, the island would be shook again by a foreign war, with the first maritime conflict of the Second World War happening in 1940, when 5 supply ships would be sunk by the German Navy. But the horrors of the conflict were still not behind the Nauruans, as the Japanese troops began occupation of the island in 1942, building airfields that were later destroyed by US bombing that would ultimately cut off food supplies. Just under a year later, the Japanese would deport 1,200 Nauruans to work in labour camps at the Cook Islands. During the Allied policy of island hopping towards Japan in the latter stages of the Second World War, Nauru was overlooked, finally being liberated in September 1945. As for the 1,200 Nauruans deported to the Cook Islands, only 745 had survived the brutality they faced under the Japanese and were repatriated to Nauru in 1946. And so the island fell once again under the control of foreign powers after the war, with a trustship being formed once again between Australia, New Zealand and the UK. In practicality though, Nauru was administered by Australia, who oversaw the continued extraction of phosphate. In 1963 it was proposed that the then 10,000 inhabitants should be moved to neighbouring islands due to the effects of mining and the impacts of the runoff damaging marine areas. However, this faced staunch opposition from the native Nauruans, and by 1968, Nauru would ultimately gain its independence, but it would be left with large swaths of the island's interior completely decimated from the mining, creating an environmental disaster, the scars of imperial greed. The following decades would see profits from the phosphate continue to steadily flow in. However, depletion was predicted by the early 2000s, so preparations for the post-mining era of Nauru were planned. A trust for the Nauruans that had been established on the onset of mining for the population had grew to a staggering £1.3 billion in value, making Nauru per capita one of the wealthiest countries in the world, second only to Saudi Arabia. No doubt disappointingly to the natives, however, corrupt investing following independence culminated in total squandery of the trust, and 2002 saw Nauru no longer paying off its loans. The assets of the once vast trust were sold, such as Nauru House, a 50-storey building in Nauru, the Mercure Hall in Sydney, and the nation's national airlines plane, to recover lost costs due to debtors. A failed musical would even further dwindle what little remained, to less than £38 million today. When the dust settled from this economic fallout, the island was on its knees. 80% of the island was left unusable, stripped of all traces of phosphate, making it completely unfit for any purpose, as it was rocky and desolate, and as a result, only narrow coastal band around the island was left fertile. Also decimated was one of Nauru's only remaining industries, fishing, with an estimated 40% of aquatic life killed off in its exclusive economic zone, from runoffs from the devastating impact of mining. Bankrupt and broken, Nauru became a tax haven to little success, and began to sell passports to foreigners for set fees, and charged just £19,000 to set up a bank in the country. The Russian mafia was even estimated to have laundered billions through the nation, and in 2002, the US Treasury would impose sanctions on the country due to its status as a money laundering state. Measures to raise funds even became as drastic as to offer recognition to unofficial nations to bring legitimacy to its claims in exchange for money. However, Nauru's economy would be in a most surprising way be somewhat rehabilitated. The offshore processing of Australia's refugees. The Tampa incident, involving 433 refugees being rescued by a Norwegian vessel that was refused admission to Australia, would catalyse the programme, but it would be riddled with problems and would be closed in 2007. However, it was reopened in 2012 and remains indefinitely open as of 2021. Australia alone now provides 2/3 of the island's £90 million GDP. As morally and politically reprehensible as this endeavour, it's the largest industry in the entire country and has against all odds increased Nauru's GDP despite high costs to Australia and the backlash faced from the public. The future of Nauru still remains in the balance. Whilst the majority of the land on Nauru is destroyed, the question of the aquatic health of Nauru's EEZ still remains in question, as deep-sea mining ventures are currently planned to commence in 2025. As the ocean surrounding Nauru is rich in nickel and cobalt. Whilst the proposition of deep-sea mining may be attractive to this relatively impoverished nation, it is hard to disregard the striking similarities of the once great phosphate mining industry that would both propel economic success and would yet lead to environmental destruction and government corruption, to this new proposition of mining in the ocean, an area already weakened. Whilst it would be easy to disregard Nauru as yet another story of rapid and sudden accumulation of wealth, ultimately being mismanaged and dithered away by those who were entrusted to it, in a similar fashion a lottery winner may, I think it is of paramount importance to think of the Nauruans in this tragic tale. Ultimately, it will be them who will suffer the consequences of destruction to such an extent and proportion on an unrivalled scale. Them who will have to rehabilitate the island's image as a once wealthy nation grappling with the frivolous nature of their corrupt politicians, and them who will make difficult decisions on how best to approach extracting and using what remains of the island's resources. However, with the history of those who strive through bloody, crippling war, illness, unquantifiable amounts of subjugation, and economic crisis, I believe forging a way through is very much possible.